December 17th, 1944, near Elsenburn Ridge, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, windless curtains, muffling everything except the deep, concussive rhythm of American 155mm howitzers. Sergeant William Kelleher crouched behind a low wall of ice-crusted sandbags, his breath frosting the edge of his scarf. For 2 days, his battery of the 2nd Infantry Division had been firing blind through fog so dense they could barely see their own gun barrels. They were holding one of the last solid positions on the northern shoulder of what would soon be called the Battle of the Bulge. When the shell left the tube, no one could see where it landed. They didn't need to. Something new was guiding their fire, something that would turn the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes into a killing field for the German infantry advancing beneath the clouds. The Americans called it the VT fuze, short for variable time. To the men who used it, it felt like magic. To the Germans who faced it, it felt like the sky itself had learned to hate them. The secret had been born, not in a trench, but in laboratories and workshops. A marriage of radio engineering and ordnance physics, so improbable that even its own creators doubted it would ever work in combat. A VT fuze was a tiny radar set, barely larger than a fist, installed in the nose of a shell. Inside its aluminum shell lived a vacuum tube oscillator, a battery activated by the shock of firing, and a miniature receiver tuned to its own reflected signal. When the projectile approached within about 10 meters of any solid object, a tree, a tank, a soldier's helmet, the returning radio wave changed frequency ever so slightly. The fuse detected the Doppler shift and detonated the charge in mid-air, scattering fragments outward and downward. It no longer mattered if the gunner's elevation was perfect or if the terrain hid the target. Each round created its own geometry of death. To appreciate how revolutionary this was, one must recall how artillery had worked for centuries. Until late 1944, every shell either exploded on impact or by means of a timed fuse cut to an estimated flight duration. Both methods demanded precision that was nearly impossible under combat stress. An error of half a second meant a burst 50 meters too high or 50 meters too low. The result was wasted ammunition or craters that buried fragments harmlessly in mud. In contrast, VT shells transformed every shot into an airburst that showered open ground with lethal steel. Against infantry caught in snow without armored protection, its efficiency multiplied by a factor of 4 to 6 compared to contact fuses, according to post-battle U.S. Army evaluations. The device's path to the Ardennes was long and guarded by the strictest secrecy of the war. Its origins lay in 1940, when British scientists at the Admiralty Research Laboratory began experimenting with miniature radio proximity sensors to defend naval guns against low-flying aircraft. The British called it the radio fuse, but they lacked the manufacturing capacity for mass production. In 1941, the design was handed to the United States under the TISAD mission. The Naval Research Laboratory and the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory took over, supported by RCA and Western Electric. By 1943, American factories were producing thousands per week, each costing roughly $18 to build, a small fortune compared to the few cents of a mechanical fuse, but insignificant next to the value of a bomber or ship it could protect. The early versions equipped naval anti-aircraft shells and proved decisive in the Pacific, downing Japanese aircraft with unprecedented accuracy. Yet the War Department forbade their use over land for fear that unexploded examples would be recovered by the enemy, who might copy the design. For 2 years, the Army waited. Only in December 1944, when German armor burst through the Ardennes and threatened to split the Allied front, did General Dwight Eisenhower authorize their release for field artillery under emergency use. Within hours, truck convoys carried wooden crates, marked VT handle with care, 2 units defending Elsenburn Ridge and Baystone, the weather-grounded Allied aircraft. The only way to stop the German advance was artillery. On December 18th, the 406th Field Artillery Group received its first batch of VT-fused shells. Observers watched as the gunners adjusted their fire over a patch of forest where elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division were moving. Through binoculars, they saw explosions not on the ground, but suspended in the air, each detonation hanging above the treetops like a flashbulb. Snowflakes caught the light, turning the forest into a shimmering storm of fragments. Within minutes, the German formation ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Survivor reports, later collected by Allied intelligence, described the experience as being attacked by invisible aircraft. At the operational level, the effect was transformative. The Bulge was a campaign of sudden breakthroughs and desperate defenses, fought largely without air support due to the winter weather. The proximity fuse restored to American forces a form of vertical dominance. It made the artillery act as a surrogate air force, raining precision bursts from above. Each shell could sweep an area roughly 25 meters in radius, enough to shred entire platoons. Batteries previously firing 200 rounds to break up an assault could achieve the same with 50. Records from the 30th Infantry Division show that in a single day of fighting near Montmedy, VT-fused artillery destroyed 4 German battalions attempting to cross open ground at a cost of fewer than 100 shells per gun. Technically, the fuse's success defied intuition. The acceleration of firing a shock exceeding 20,000 grams would normally shatter any glass tube. Engineers at Johns Hopkins solved this by suspending the vacuum tube's filaments in spring mounts and designing the circuit to activate only after the projectile's deceleration stabilized. A tiny mercury battery, sealed in glass, came alive from the force of firing, providing current for no more than 40 seconds. The entire system had to function autonomously, without any external control, while spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. That such delicate electronics could survive the violence of artillery fire was, in itself, an engineering miracle. The German army had nothing comparable. Their fuses remained mechanical, relying on clockwork timers and impact triggers. Captured documents revealed that German scientists had experimented with radio proximity concepts, but failed to miniaturize the components. Vacuum tubes, small enough for a shell nose, were beyond their production capability, partly because of shortages in materials like tungsten and high-grade glass. When the first VT bursts tore through their infantry in the Ardennes, they had no idea what caused them. Intelligence reports from the 5th Panzer Army speak of mysterious shells that explode in the air and cannot be avoided. Some soldiers speculated that the Americans had developed infrared sensors, or that Allied aircraft were directing artillery remotely. For US commanders, the secret had to be guarded, even amid success. Every gun crew using VT ammunition was briefed under penalty of court-martial never to let a dud fall into enemy hands. Patrols were ordered to recover unexploded shells whenever possible. After the war, German ordnance experts examined fragments and concluded they were radar-based. But by then the technology had already advanced. On the tactical map, the proximity fuse's contribution can be traced along a 15-mile line from Monchaux to Montmedy, where the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held firm against repeated assaults. The Germans threw at least 6 divisions into this northern push, expecting to seize the Elsenborn Ridge in 2 days. They never did. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army Ballistics Research Laboratory estimated that VT fuses increased artillery effectiveness against personnel by roughly 60%. That edge translated directly into time. The Americans bought the critical 72 hours needed for reinforcements to close the gap, and for skies to clear, allowing Allied aircraft to return. Weather data from December 19th showed temperatures at 10 degrees Celsius, with visibility under 500 meters. In such conditions, artillery dominated. Each forward observer operated under minimal communication, relying on wire lines that often froze solid. When the fog lifted briefly on December 23rd, the ground before Elsenborn was littered with German dead, many showing wounds from above, rather than the side-clear evidence of airburst fragmentation. Forensic teams later found fragments embedded in tree trunks 2 to 3 meters above ground, consistent with detonations around 8 meters altitude, precisely the height the VT fuse was designed to achieve. By the end of the Bulge campaign in January 1945, American artillery had fired approximately 1.2 million VT-fused shells. Records vary between 1.1 and 1.3 million depending on source, but even the lower figure represented a technological tipping point. The enemy's morale suffered beyond repair. German prisoners captured near St. Vith told interrogators that the shelling was inhuman, claiming they had no warning and no cover. One officer described it as a storm from the sky with no sound until it was too late. Strategically, the success validated a doctrine of technological surprise. The Allies had gambled by releasing their most secret weapon to a fluid battlefield, knowing that each recovered dud might give the enemy a priceless clue. The risk paid off. By the time Germany understood what had struck them, their war was collapsing on every front. The same principle soon migrated into air defense and naval warfare. Within months, VT fuses armed the 5-inch guns that protected convoys against kamikaze attacks, doubling their hit probability. In engineering retrospect, the VT fuse represented the first combat use of an autonomous electronic sensor, direct ancestor of modern smart munitions. It blended radio physics, micromanufacturing, and statistical warfare into a single package, small enough to fit in a soldier's hand. Each fuse contained roughly 130 individual parts, assembled by a workforce of 60,000 across 100 factories, many of them women trained from scratch in electronics. The total wartime production exceeded 22 million units by August 1945. The ethical dimension was harder to quantify. Artillery had always been impersonal, but the proximity fuse made killing almost algorithmic. Infantrymen under VT fire spoke of the horror of being struck from above, of explosions that seemed to follow movement. In German letters recovered from the battlefield, soldiers compared it to a god's punishment descending through the air. Yet for the American gunners, it was salvation. On those frozen ridges, every shell meant one less German-reaching Bastogne, one more day to hold the line. When the Bulge finally receded, and the snow melted into mud, the truth of what had happened became clear. The last great German offensive of the war had failed, not only because of Allied resilience, but because of a silent shift in the physics of warfare. A miniature radar transmitter, operating for less than half a minute at a frequency around 200 MHz, had turned steel and circuitry into a decisive weapon. Historians later ranked it alongside the atomic bomb and radar itself as one of the 3 technologies that ensured Allied victory. The VT fuse's story ended quietly. After 1945, its design was declassified and became the foundation for modern proximity sensing in missiles and anti-aircraft systems. The scientists who built it returned to universities and industry, often anonymous. But on that freezing December morning at Elsenborn Ridge, when Sergeant Kelleher saw the forest erupt in mid-air flashes and heard the German advance dissolve into silence, he understood something profound. The future of war would belong to those who could make machines think in fractions of a second. In the Ardennes, for the first time, the machines had done just that. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.